Again, within a lifetime, it has been shown that people who have been exposed to trauma and violence will have epigenetic signatures. But the question is, will they be transferred to future generations?
So welcome to the Healthspan podcast. I'm so honored today to be joined by Dr. Rana Dajani, who's a molecular biologist and also the founder of We Love Reading Initiative, but also widely recognized as one of the most influential female scientists in the Arab world. And with her newest 2025 study on intergenerational epigenetic inheritance, I believe she's well on her way to being named one of the world's most influential female scientists of all time. So I'm very honored to have you here with me today. Dr. Dajani wears many hats, or as she will tell you, scarves. But she is a global fellow at Harvard Graduate School of Education, a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Germany, a fellow of the Morse College at Yale University, fellow at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and also a professor of molecular cell biology at the Hashemite University in Jordan, and an International Science Council fellow and the visionary founder, of the We Love Reading Initiative. So that's a huge lot there. But today we'll be talking about your work on epigenetics and the inheritance of trauma. And I think it's not just scientifically groundbreaking, but profoundly human. So, in a time where we're beginning to connect the dots between early life experience and long-term health outcomes, these findings have a very big significance and implications of, in how we approach resilience and chronic illness and longevity. So very, very welcome and very happy to have you on today's call.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to share.
Dr. Dajani, so tell me about this concept of you wear many hats or scarves. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So, when people talk about the many roles they play, they talk about many hats they wear. But I don't wear a hat, I wear a scarf. So I talk about the multiple scarves I wear. The first one is that I'm a mother. I have 4 children who have grown up now, but to me, that's the most important role any human being can play in the world, because you're bringing up the next generation. And isn't everything we do for the next generation? But we don't talk about that role as much when we present ourselves. We take it for granted when it's really the most important one we can offer humanity. The second role that I play, or the scarf that I wear, is that I'm a teacher. Educator. I was actually a school teacher for 10 years before I went and did my PhD, and then came back to the university where I also teach. And I think being a teacher is the second most important role, because a teacher, the children, if they're not at home, they're at school. And the teacher's role in molding and forming and inspiring and being a role model for future generations can never be underestimated. Yet we also don't give due credit to teachers who are producing the next generation, building those critical thinking skills, those being innovative minds going forward to deal with the future. The third role is I'm a scientist. I get a kick and a thrill from trying to understand how molecules interact, how cells communicate, and I love to be curious and to ask questions. And that's why I have 2 fields of work. I work on ethnic populations, looking at their genetics and looking at certain complex diseases like cardiovascular disease or cancer and diabetes in these populations, the Circassians and the Chechens in Jordan. And then my second field, which is now the most prominent one, is trying to understand how trauma impacts refugees and vulnerable communities who have been exposed to violence, not just in terms of their mental health, but more importantly, on their DNA, which is what we call epigenetics. My fourth scarf is I am a social innovator. I've started a program called We Love Reading, which is about changing mindsets through reading to nurture change makers. The program now has spread to 73 countries around the world. So it's like a movement, a good virus that is spreading beyond boundaries to inspire not just children to fall in love with reading and have critical thinking skills, but for the adults who are reading aloud to the children, who mostly are women, especially coming from vulnerable communities, who themselves find their voices literally by reading, but also figuratively by becoming leaders in their own right in their community. My fifth scarf, usually I don't tell people what it is, and I invite them to read my book, which you can guess, it's called 5 Scarves, Doing the Impossible. If we can redefine self-fate, why can't we reimagine success? But I'll tell you what it is. It's about being an activist and defending human rights, especially today. With what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in Gaza, the ongoing genocide, it is our duty as scientists, as social innovators, as human beings, to stand up for humanity, that every life is equal, and we must not allow inequality and violence and atrocity and crimes against humanity to prevail. And it's not up to us to hold those accountable and not allow any impunity and to speak up and say the truth. That's the least we can do. And by the way, all the problems we face today in this 21st century, from climate change to racism to inequality to the rise of the far right and the genocide in Gaza, they're all connected. LGBTQ rights, Black Lives Matter, indigenous peoples' rights, they're all connected together because it's all about power and money. So we need to find the source of all this, stop it, so that we can have social justice, equality, and peace for all.
I think this very much brings us back to this point of trauma, right?
Exactly.
Because there's an element of trauma that runs through all of this. But from your personal experience, what was it that inspired you to look at the inheritance of trauma from a scientific point of view?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a scientist, and all scientists, and actually maybe all human beings, follow this mantra, which was said by one Nobel Prize physicist. He said, a scientist is somebody who sees what everybody sees, but thinks what no one has thought. And I think that's a human trait, right? Every human being is new to this world, and therefore sees the world in a different perspective, and therefore can identify challenges or find even solutions or answers to things. So in that context, as a scientist in Jordan, wanting to contribute to science internationally and make a difference, that's when I noticed how people talk about trauma. People talk about trauma, especially in the Western literature, in the scientific Western literature, as if it's one event and then what happens after the event. And to me, that didn't make sense, because my father is from Jerusalem, from Palestine. He was 5 years old in 1948 when Zionist forces evicted him violently with all his family and all the neighborhood outside of Palestine. And so the trauma has been ongoing since 1948. And we see it today with Gaza and the genocide just repeating itself. And my mother is Syrian. Half her family is from Hama and half from Aleppo. And in Hama, there was a massacre in 1982 where many members of my extended mother's family were tortured, imprisoned, or executed. And many of those came to our house and who ran away in 1982. So I'm very intimately familiar with the trauma that human beings have been going through, especially in my part of the world. And to consider it one event and just study what happens after does not make sense, on one hand. And on the other hand, also, who is studying this? They are usually Western people who don't also understand the culture and the context and the lived histories, and therefore, as a scientist myself and a daughter of refugees, I thought that I wanted to explore this question, try to understand how does trauma impact our bodies, those who have been exposed to it in a continuous form, and what does it change in our body? Is it just our behavior? Is it our physiology? Is it our DNA? And do we transfer those changes, especially the DNA changes, to future generations? So that's what inspired me to ask that question. And knowing the literature and knowing the scientific body, nobody had answered that question in humans. People had answered the question in animal models, because it's easy to create the conditions where you expose one, say, a generation of mice to trauma and the other you don't, and then you see what happens in future generations. But you can't do that in humans. But my intimate knowledge of the history, I was able to design a study to answer that question.
So we've known for a very long time that early childhood trauma can impact on health outcomes. And that's been, we've known that in the literature for a really long time. But your study is a lot more interesting because it's also showing us that trauma can go across generations. Can you say a little bit more about that? So it's not just our own trauma, but it's the trauma of our ancestors and those before us.
So again, as a scientist, I cannot go beyond the results of our research. But what I can say that human beings who've been around for between 200 to 300,000 years as a species on Earth, we have been exposed to struggles and strifes and violence. Yet, to look at us today, we have survived, we have thrived, and we have flourished. So yes, despite that, we can keep on going. So the question then becomes, what does that mean? How does that look like? How can we understand it? And as you said, we know that children who have been exposed to different types of abuse or trauma in their childhood is reflected in their, let's say, in their diseases, percentages in older age. This is documented in different ways in different communities for different diseases, from early life to midlife to end of life. However, the question still remains, what are those changes on the DNA? And there have been some documentation on looking at epigenetic changes on the DNA as a result of early exposure. But also, we don't know if those are passed on to future generations or not. Hence, the importance of our study.
So for those who are new to the concept of epigenetics, can you explain what that means, and especially in the context of trauma?
Yes. So, as a human being, you manifest in the world, or your phenotype, as we say, is a combination of the DNA or genes that you inherit from your parents. The sperm is contributed by the father, the ova is contributed by the mother. They unite, and you have the zygote, which is one cell that starts to multiply and forms the human body. But also this human body, as it grows from one cell to a full human being, and then throughout their lifetime, are exposed to the environment, different things, from what you eat and drink, your lifestyle, your community, your ecosystem around you, whether you're exposed to love and care or not, exposed to violence or not. So all these experiences also contribute to who you are, to your phenotype. And they do so also, the combination of the environment's impact on your DNA is what we call epigenetics. So what does that mean? Is that your DNA, it does not change as a result of an exposure to an environmental stimulus. However, the genes can be turned on or off as a result of that exposure. What does that mean? That because of the exposure, certain chemical modifications, which are methyl groups, for example, which is one of those modifications, is added onto your DNA. This results that your DNA is either tightly wound or unwound. And the result is your gene is turned on or turned off. And when a gene is turned on or turned off, it means that it will be expressed if it's turned on, and it becomes a protein and has a function. And if it's turned off, it is not expressed, there's no protein, and therefore there's no function. So it's just like a lever or switch of turning on and off genes. That is what we call epigenetics. So for every human being, you have your genome, which is your DNA that usually does not change throughout your lifetime unless you were exposed to an atomic bomb. But your epigenome, which is the modifications on the genes, does change throughout your lifetime because of the different environmental exposures. And this starts from being one cell, and then a fetus in the womb of your mother, and then when you're born as a toddler, and then as a child, as a teenager, and then as an adult, and then later in life, your epigenome will change. And as a result of what you were exposed to in the environment. Now, in the context of trauma, which we wanted to study, if a person is exposed in different stages of their life to a violent event, what happens is that the hypothesis is that certain genes will have modifications and they will be turned on or off. So that there will be epigenetic marks as a result of that exposure. As we said, we know this happens in animals and mice who are mammals like us. So the expectation is that we have the same. Again, within a lifetime, it has been shown that people who have been exposed to trauma and violence will have epigenetic signatures. But the question is, will they be transferred to future generations?
So in your study, you looked at 3 generations of Syrian women. What did you discover about trauma and its impact on the genome?
So in order to answer the question about how does exposure to trauma get passed on in the epigenome from one generation to the other, we had to design a very elaborate research study to ensure that what we were seeing in the 3rd generation was real and not as a result of randomness or other factors or other variables. And that's where the intimate knowledge of the history and the context and the culture was very, very important. So we took, first of all, the first cohort were grandmothers who were pregnant in 1982 and therefore were exposed to the massacre that happened in Hama, 1982. And then we took samples from them, their daughters who were not exposed to trauma, and their granddaughters who were not exposed to trauma. And we took 2 granddaughters who were not exposed to trauma. So we have enough members of the family to compare to. But that's not enough. We also, to compare them, we took another group where the grandmothers came from the same city, were pregnant in 1982, but were not exposed to the trauma that happened in 1982. But their daughters were exposed to the uprising that happened in 2011 in Syria, and were pregnant at that time. And then we looked at the 2 granddaughters from that cohort who were not exposed, one born before the 2011 uprising, and therefore not exposed to trauma, and one born after. And then in the third cohort, we took grandmothers, granddaughters, and the mothers from the same region who had left Syria way before 1982, and therefore they were not exposed to trauma at all. And then we compared across all of them. So we had some who were direct exposed to trauma when they were pregnant. We had some who were exposed to trauma when they were in utero as fetuses in the wombs of their mothers. And then we had some who were not only exposed when they were eggs in the fetus, in the womb of the grandmother. So this is what we call germline. So those were the three types of exposure that we were able to look and trace the impact of the trauma in these three generations and in the three different cohorts within the Syrian community. And of course, it took so much time and effort to find these families with these strict conditions that to fit the study. It took us 7 years by word of mouth, reaching out to different groups. And because I'm Syrian, I was able to do that. And then I gained invited to join the team, Dima Hamadmad, which is also a daughter of Syrian refugees who had fled in 1982 to Jordan. And she was instrumental in going and visiting each family, interviewing them, collecting the data about their trauma exposure, and then the cheek swab, which is the how we take the DNA from the inner cheek with a little cotton swab, a very special cotton swab, and building that trust. Because when we were collecting the samples, the Assad regime was still in power. And these people were scared. Were scared of what they were sharing with us, their stories. But they trusted us because they knew we were from the same community. And we explained to them the science, respecting their intellect and knowledge. So we explained what this means, and we explained that we don't know what we're going to discover, but we will together be contributing to science to make a better world for their future, the future of their children, the future of humanity. And they participated with such enthusiasm because they wanted to make a difference in their lives. They wanted to have hope that they could make a difference in the lives of their children going forward. Now, of course, in order to estimate and study and assess the exposure to trauma, I could not do that. I had to look for experts because science is, you don't do science alone. You need a team. That's how you do science. And so I looked for the best person who could assess the trauma, the specialist, and I invited Professor Catherine Panterbrick from Yale University, who I had known before and had collaborated with on another project dealing with adolescent Syrian refugees. So I called her up and told her, Catherine, I explained to her the question I had in mind and the research design I had in mind. And she joined the team and she helped design actually what are the surveys we want to use to assess the trauma exposure. How do we make sure that they all have the same socioeconomic status? How do we assess the demographics of these different women? So that was her part in the team so that we could do better science. And we had chosen to look only at the maternal lineage, not the paternal, although we could have looked at both. But, in science, you have to make choices. You can't do everything. So we chose the maternal line, and hopefully maybe in the future we could do a paternal lineage as well. But then after we collected all these cheek swabs and put them in a freezer in Jordan, I am a genetist and I study genetics. But being in Jordan, a developing country, we didn't have at my university the resources to be able to conduct the lab work, which is DNA extraction and then the epigenetic analysis. We didn't have the funding, we didn't have the facilities. And so I also looked for a partner. And that's how I invited Connie Mulligan, who is a genetist at University of Florida and who has a lab that works on epigenetics. So she joined the team and we became three, who were three partners who were working together to answer this question. So we shipped the samples to her lab, and she was able, with Catherine, to obtain funding to cover the cost of some of the field work and the lab work. And then together, we invited a fourth person to help in the statistical analysis of this very elaborate research design. And together we made our discoveries that were published in scientific reports that we're talking about.
And that's been published in the journal Nature, which is a very prestigious journal. So I'm sure you've got getting a lot of traction on that as well. And what did you find? What did you find in the data?
Yes. So our results, what we found, first of all, in terms of what we found in terms of the details of the result is we identified 14 sites in the epigenome whose methylation was associated with germline exposure to violence. What that means is that those germ cells, those ova that were in the fetus in the womb of the mother, in 1982, those were not became in the future granddaughters. They were not exposed themselves to trauma, yet 14 sites in their genome had a methylation. So that was the first discovery. Because we know most DNA methylation marks are removed prior to birth for epigenetic reprogramming. And now we are showing intriguing evidence that some marks may escape reprogramming, and that a small subset of those methylation marks that escaped reprogramming are very environmentally sensitive and therefore are intergenerationally heritable, and therefore allow humans to adapt to environmental stressors such as psychological stress and violence for future generations. So that's our first discovery. The second discovery, we've discovered 21 sites also associated with direct exposure to violence. So the grandmother who was exposed when she was pregnant, or the mother who was exposed in 2011 when she was pregnant. And people have documented direct exposure to violence, but we're adding new evidence for that and new sites for that. For the 32 of both those sites, we showed similar change in DNA methylation across all the exposures, the direct exposure, the prenatal exposure, and the germline exposure, which suggests that there's a common epigenetic signature of violence across generations and developmental stages. They're all going in the same direction, which emphasizes that this is a real result and not just a random result or as a result of other things like behavior. Our third result, we have been able to show accelerated epigenetic aging in association with prenatal exposure to violence. And this highlights the importance of the critical period of the in utero development. So when the fetus is dividing, those cells are very sensitive to what's happening around them in the mother's womb, and therefore they had this accelerated aging. We didn't find this accelerated aging in the adult or in those passed on to the third generation. And this is very important when we talk about all the genocide in Gaza or other violence, where I think in Gaza there's 1,000 pregnant women. What does that mean for the future generation being exposed to this? And we had also mentioned that the accelerated epigenetic aging has association with future complex disorders and diseases in the lives of these unborn children. So those are our discoveries.
So, I mean, that's very significant, showing that the impact for these individuals on health, even generations later, can be significant, even when they themselves have not experienced any trauma. That impact on health is very huge.
Absolutely, absolutely.
One of the things I really admire about you is the way in which you frame your research, because we are looking at something so serious, but rather than just documenting harm, I think you also highlight resilience and adaptability and agency. Can you speak a little bit about that shift in perspective?
Yes. So because those 14 sites that we had discovered in the grandchildren who are not exposed to trauma were not part, after our research and looking, we're not part of any known biological pathway related to stress or anxiety, or even cell growth or immunity for that matter. And therefore, we suggest that those 14 sites are related to higher regulatory functions within the epigenome. And what that means is that, and because those 14 sites were inherited, that means that the grandchildren have inherited a capacity, because of this higher regulatory changes, to adapt and be malleable and resilient to future exposures from an environment that we cannot predict. Now, what does this mean? And if we compare, it means that, let me say this in a better way, it suggests an alternative narrative to what is already known, because usually the status quo labels survivors as either victims or heroes. And when we say they are victims, that's not good. It doesn't fit evolutionary history. We know, as I mentioned, we survived and thrived. And labeling them as victims actually is a continuation of a colonial framing from the occupier to the occupied. And it doesn't ring true. I'm a daughter of refugees and I'm not a victim. But then the alternative was we are heroes. The labeling of survivors as heroes, which is also a weight on the survivors. Maybe they're not heroes. Why do we have to be heroes? Why do we have to be either or? So our findings suggest an alternative narrative. Epigenetic signatures of trauma may serve higher regulatory functions, offering future generations a spectrum of adaptive strategies for unpredictable environments, much like other intelligent and social organisms, by the way. If we look at the animal kingdom or nature around us, for example, humans are very social creatures. We survive not because we're smarter, but because we're very, very social. And we must not underestimate this function. And to be social, that means you're being exposed to a very highly complex environment. And therefore, we hypothesize that those 14 sites help us to adapt to complex environments, especially socially. So the perspective, this new perspective that I'm calling for, calls for celebrating diversity, fostering trusting communities to shape their own futures, and embracing, in a way, a decolonized approach to science, one that serves humanity by fostering understanding, resilience, and equity, which is how we survived as a species, and a better way going forward for everybody.
I really like that. I think that's really powerful. So in other words, trauma can leave a mark, but as humans, we have this ability to adapt. And that does feel so important, moving from that space of victim to, to knowing that we have the capacity to adapt. I think that's a really positive message.
And I've coined, we wrote a perspective around this. And what we say in it is that we're recognizing, let me phrase it, is that what we wrote is about we've challenging the Western victim-based framing of trauma and proposing instead that inherited epigenetic change provide future generations with adaptive tools to navigate unpredictable environments. And I call this my grandmother's wisdom, what I inherit from my grandmother. And this helps us recognize that this resilience shifts how we approach policy, intervention, scientific inquiry, and we shift from being victimhood and vulnerability to agency and adaptability.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is such an important message. Do you think that trauma-based epigenetic changes could explain some of the chronic conditions that we are seeing today? Autoimmunity, depression, metabolic disorders. Do you believe that may be a role to play?
So yes, exposure to the environment results in changes in our DNA, which is turning on and off the genes that will impact what we develop in future life. As you said, different diseases from depression, anxiety, but also cardiovascular disease, diabetes, even cancer. However, we cannot interpret more than the results that we have. We did not answer that question in particular. But there are other studies who have shown that direct exposure can result in changes that may affect different pathways related to immune disorders and so on. So yes, but we need to do more research to understand exactly what's happening. And this leads me what is the future? The future is trying to understand what do the 21 sites of direct exposure mean, to look for them in animal models or in other cohorts. What do the 14 sites that have been inherited by the third generation, what do they mean? Looking for them in animal models or in other cohorts, and doing more research to see if we can find the same in other examples. So now, for example, I have started another team to look at 4 generations of Palestinians who have been exposed to trauma. Because in our research, we have only shown intergenerational trauma, which is going from the grandmother through the granddaughter. We want to also answer the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, which is going from the grandmother to the great-granddaughter. And these are not easy. Again, the intimate knowledge of the society and community and history helps us do that. And that's what we're doing in Palestine. The other question we're trying to answer also is in Palestine, people have been living a continuous trauma across 4 generations. So we want to see what is the epigenetic signature of a continuous trauma compared to one event of a trauma that the grandmother was exposed to. So these are 2 questions we're working on going forward in the future.
Okay. And that is interesting because, in communities like that, like you say, it's ongoing trauma over generations. But there are also situations where it could be an individual kind of one event trauma, which can also, then have an impact. In your view, what role does healing the nervous system, creating safety, nurturing love and connection play in rewriting some of these patterns? Can we rewrite them? Is there anything people can do once these markers have kind of been handed down?
So in epigenetics, usually we're asking 3 questions. The first question is, what are the genes that are turned on and off as a result of an exposure to an environmental stimulus, in this case, trauma? And people are working on that, and we have shown these 21 sites that nobody had reported earlier. The second question is, can you reverse those within the lifetime of the individual? Again, there are some evidence that for certain epigenetic signatures that there are interventions that can reverse those effects. We're actually working on a study, an intervention on adolescents, seeing if that results in reversal of epigenetic markers. This is still work in progress, but the assumption it is because in animal models it works. Now, the third question about those you inherit across 3 generations that we have just answered in this study, whether those can be reversed or not, we don't know. Again, this is all very, very new. And as in any good science, you answer one question and you come up with 10 more. And I think we've come up with more than 10 new questions that us and others can work in the future to try and attempt to understand.
So what message would you have for people out there who perhaps have been the victim of trauma and are feeling impacted through perhaps their physical or mental or emotional health as a result of this?
So actually, I went and visited one of the families who I collected their DNA 10 years ago, 15. After the results came out, 2 weeks ago, I went and visited the family, talked with the grandmother, the daughter, and the granddaughter. Now, of course, the granddaughter was 2, now she's 12. And she was telling me that she wants to be a physician. They were really happy to see the results for 2 reasons. One, because when they gave us the samples and told us their stories 10 years ago, the Assad regime was still in power and they were scared and everything was a whisper and they trusted us. Today, because the Assad regime fell, they were able to celebrate publicly and talk about their trauma publicly without fear. But also, and of course, the results came out on the anniversary of the Hama massacre of 1982. So that was very serendipity that they came out at the same time, which kind of honored those victims by publishing these results at that same time, although it wasn't intentional. But the second reason is that now that they have this evidence, they have evidence in their DNA of the atrocities that they were exposed to. What does this imply? Well, it could imply, and again, I'm speculating, that these could be used in a court of law to hold those perpetrators accountable as a result of this. And that way, our sciences doesn't just add to the scientific literature, to the scientific understanding of human body and human biology, but it also helps us do better science for humanity, helping the people who have been exposed to the atrocities, I don't want to use the word victim, to hold those accountable. And hopefully when we hold those perpetrators accountable, this will be the first step in ending violence, because we have social justice, we have equity, and nobody has impunity and everybody is equal in front of the law. So those are some of the implications. The second implications on the Syrian families was that we didn't, as we said, these 14 sites are not associated with a pathway of depression or anxiety or cancer or immune function. So this gives us, as I said, hope that this is for them that their body the children, the grandchildren inherited adaptability, resilience, which gives them agency. And they're not like set on a deterministic path of I'm a victim, I'm going to be, I'm going to survive as a victim and be depressed. I have choices. And this reminds us of the diversity of the human species, of the human population. Yes, some will maybe encounter depression and anxiety, and some will be heroes. And you have everybody in between. And that's important to remember, that every human being is important and contributes to society and has a function that is very, very important. And we don't have to fit ourselves in boxes. That's very limiting. We can have agency over how we want to go forward. And having agency actually gives you resilience. And I like to use the word sumud. Sumud is an Arabic word, which means to be steadfast. And we see this in the actions of the people in Gaza. They're being genocided, yet they rise and they say and they care for each other and they love each other. And we forget about those things. As a species, we survived because we are social creatures, as I mentioned earlier. We have families, we have communities, we take care of each other. And unfortunately, if this is lost, we lose that cushion, that buffering that helps us cope with the trauma and the violent exposures we are exposed to. So that's one very important point that we need to remind ourselves about. And creatures who have high social capacity usually have high epigenetics. As I said, in octopus, for example, octopus are very, very social creatures. So they have huge epigenetic regulation. It may be downstream, not at the level of the DNA, but at the level of proteins and RNA. Similar, we have epigenetic changes that we are inheriting. So this results gives us adaptability in the face of adversity and in the face of this complex environment. The second thing we see in the people of Gaza is their faith. Their faith and their spirituality, which we call religion, is what keeps them going because they have a higher purpose, they have a cause. And how those between social and taking care and having faith combined together gives you this sumud, the steadfastness in the face of atrocities. And as a species, if we look at cultural anthropology, religion evolved with us as a way to cope with what's going on around us. Creating complex societies is a way to cope with the complex environment around us. And unfortunately, with Western civilization, we're losing the social component, the family, and we're losing the spirituality. And there's a vacuum. And if we don't fill that vacuum, that's when challenges happen, like anxiety and depression and so on. So I hope this is just a blip in human evolution, and we will somehow go back to what we have evolved as a species of caring for each other, loving for each other, and doing better for humanity.
I can't agree with you more, because when we look at longevity research and health span, there's such an element of having purpose, and community is kind of the two of the biggest things that stand out when we look at those really important elements of communities where there is longevity. And so I think that it's such an incredibly important element of health and well-being. So I'm glad that you've said that, because I think that's absolutely critical. Dr. Dajani, thank you so much for being with us today and for the generosity of your work, which I think is going to have such a huge rippling impact, throughout the world. And you've taken a really complex and a very delicate subject, trauma, and you've actually shown us how people can carry that not just as a burden, but really as a way of building hope for the future as well.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, I have a granddaughter who's almost 3, and she has reminded me of what everything is all about. We get preoccupied by life and everyday things, and we forget what's the real purpose of life. It's caring for the future generation, being there for them, offering them hope and love and care, and an environment that protects them, despite what happens around us, because life happens and things happen. And so having the biological evidence for this and striving to answer more questions to solidify it, because again, we cannot interpret more than what the results have, but we can speculate and hypothesize more. I think this is what allows us to do better science for humanity, and lets me tell my granddaughter that she has choices and opportunities. She is not just determined by what she inherited, but she can make a difference in the future. And for her future and future generations.
Absolutely.
And maybe I want to add one point also.
Yeah, please do.
Also, the story of this research is also another message that when you are from the community and a scientist, you do better science, because you know the intricacy of the community, and therefore you can ask better scientific questions. And this is usually not the case. And so I hope that this story will inspire scientists from local communities, indigenous communities, to spearhead research, to ask those questions boldly. Create a team. Yes, they can't do everything like me. I couldn't do everything alone. I had to have a team, and reach out and work in a team. Again, back to community. And then we can do better science for humanity as a result of that.
I think your research shows exactly that, the fact also you're talking about trust and going into communities that have, experienced a lot of violence, and then, being able to go into a very, very vulnerable situation and develop that trust is so important. And you can only do that when you have kind of a genuinely authentic understanding of the cultural situation. So, and science often is in the hands of the very few. So I agree with you. It needs to be going out more into communities, with people being involved in their own research and science. And listen, have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.